So
Is it being recorded?
Thank you. Yeah, so I want to introduce our speaker today for the community conversations that we have been holding for the past couple months. Once a month from 12 to 1, we have these community meetings, right, where we bring in different speakers to talk about the impacts of sustainability, climate change, health, environmental justice is one of them as well. So I want to introduce our speaker today. Her name is Catherine Catalano. She is a Deputy Director of the Center for Climate Health and Equity at the American Public Health Association. Catherine is a communicator, strategic planner, and leader with expertise in climate policy, advocacy, and education across sectors and audiences with a particular focus on centering justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in every aspect of the climate movement. Catherine is passionate about applying her skills and experience to affect change and bring stakeholders together to advocate for climate justice and equitable health outcomes. And it is a privilege for me to also know her in the capacity of a colleague and also a friend, and continue to work with her on projects that advance environmental justice and climate equity across, not just in our local communities, but across the country. So with that, I'll hand it over to Catherine Catalano with the title of the presentation, Climate, Health, and Environmental Justice.
Thank you so much, Beto. I'm very happy to be here to speak with all of you today. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay, share. Can y'all see that presentation? All right, I'm going to go ahead and get it into presenter view. Okay, great. Awesome. So thank you all for being here today. I know we don't have a whole lot of time and I'm covering a pretty big topic here. So I'm going to go through an overview on the health effects of climate change, particularly through an equity and justice lens, thinking about how these impacts affect different populations in an unequal way. And I'll go through some deeper topics on climate justice and health equity, and make sure I try to leave some time for questions as well. So we'll go ahead and dive in with just sort of a very quick list here, and we'll go into more of these in more detail shortly. But a quick list of several of the health impacts from climate change. Climate change, obviously, folks used to call it more commonly global warming. It does have to do with the warming of our surface temperatures and our ocean temperatures, which have wide-ranging effects on our entire ecological system. But warming isn't really all that it does. And we have leaned more towards the larger climate change name now. So these sorts of challenges exacerbate health inequities that communities of color and low-income people already face. All of these impacts, heat waves, changing patterns of disease transmission, compromised air quality, food security threats, water contamination, rising seas and flooding, natural disasters, and mental health complications. And we'll go into each of these a little bit deeper. So temperatures. Again, one of the first things that come to mind when we talk about climate change. Temperatures over 90 degrees Fahrenheit can be dangerous, extremely dangerous, especially over time. You can see longer and hotter warm seasons with more extreme heat days, which are dangerous for everyone, especially folks that work outdoors or don't have access to air conditioning. And we can see multi-day heat waves that can put a huge energy burden on systems while folks are trying to find relief and running their ACs all at the same time. We've seen in some parts of the countries, multi-day heat waves can lead to power shortages and issues that leave folks even more exposed to this kind of heat. Extreme heat is increasingly more common. 17 of the country's 18 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001. In 2017, periods of extreme heat broke state records throughout the summer and fall all across the country. Every state had an annual average temperature that was warmer than usual, and we're continuing to see those trends. There has been a dramatic increase in hot nighttime temperatures in the US, reducing the hours of relief during heat waves. And the World Health Organization reports that extended periods of high temperatures create cumulative physiological stress on the human body, which exacerbates the top causes of death globally, including respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and renal disease. Heat waves can acutely impact large populations for short periods of time and can trigger public health emergencies. Heat stroke is a condition caused by your body overheating, usually as a result of prolonged exposure to or physical exertion in high temperatures. So these are just some details here on how extreme heat can affect your health. And then there's something even more pronounced in cities called the heat island effect. And this especially sees disproportionate effects for vulnerable communities in urban areas. Cities on average are far higher temperature than the surrounding areas during these extreme heat days. And that's due to several factors. It's all of the dark surfaces in cities, from asphalt to the buildings themselves, absorbing a lot of the heat from the sun. It's all of the energy produced in cities, all the people, vehicles lead to a temperature increase. All of these things together, certain things help. Evaporative cooling from trees helps reduce temperatures in cities, as does large water sources for the same purpose. But for the most part, cities are extremely hot compared to their surrounding areas, and the risk is greater. You can see here demonstrated the heat island effect in Kansas City. Overall, on average, the heat is 5.8 degrees Fahrenheit more intense in Kansas City than in the surrounding areas due to all of these effects I mentioned earlier. You can see on the left here a near surface air temperature in Kansas City based on rural, suburban, or the urban core. That urban core in the middle is significantly hotter. And you can see from these aerial views that a lot of that has to do with tree cover. You'll see there that that middle picture is the urban core. You see a lot less green than in these other satellite images from other cross sections of the city. And this is pronounced all over the country. You know, you can see it in any large metropolitan area that you can look at. And in many cases, even within those urban cores, you see a lot less tree cover and therefore a lot less evaporative cooling in low-income communities and communities of color. We see this with a lot of infrastructure advancements, that investments tend to miss these communities, not on accident. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second here. But one of those investments is parks and tree cover. It's for enjoyment, it's for cooling, it improves the air quality. Trees are a lovely, lovely solution to a lot of the ails that cities are facing in response to the climate crisis. And even in the urban cores, you tend to see more tree cover in white communities. We've worked with partners on specific analyses in certain areas. Baltimore was a recent one, examining individual communities. And this is just seen in every case across the board. Now, when I talked about those investments, often skipping communities of color, investments in more modern infrastructure, in trees and parks and things like that, we can trace a lot of that back to discriminatory land use choices made since redlining all the way back in the 1930s. And it has continued to this day to determine where investments are made in many of our cities. Private and public investments. And when we're talking about tree cover and parks and things like that, that's a public investment. Private investments and, you know, home values and the consequences of redlining are very, very broad. But, you know, folks literally took maps of cities and drew red lines around neighborhoods that were considered unsafe, quote unquote, investments. They were neighborhoods and communities of color. And to this day, you see the impacts of that in the infrastructure, in the home values of those communities. And part of that does impact heat. It also impacts air quality. And we'll talk about how highway siting and road and industrial facility siting plays into those disparities as well. But first, we'll go back and look at some of the basics of air quality, how climate change worsens it, and how that affects our health. Exposures, as far as things that hurt our health through air quality, are ambient air pollutants, wildfire smoke, pollen, and mold. Air pollutants can, for the most part, when we're talking about air pollutants, we're talking about ground level ozone. Ozone is something that's great in the atmosphere, not so great at the ground level. A lot of that comes from combustion engines and car exhaust, and increases our susceptibility to irritants and exacerbates a lot of existing lung issues, as well as can cause over long-term exposure, lung issues in communities, asthma, allergies, heart disease, premature death can all come from these kinds of exposures. Aside from ozone, the other primary air pollutants that we like to talk about is particulate matter, also commonly coming from combustion engines and traffic and vehicles. So you'll see much higher levels of these pollutants in cities as well. And those particles embed themselves in linings of the lung, increase irritation, increase coughing fits, exacerbate a lot of these issues, cause them with long-term exposure, just like ozone. Ozone is produced through a chemical reaction. Particulate matter is exactly what it sounds like, direct particles in the air. Pollen and mold are also irritants that can exacerbate a lot of these health issues. And you'll see pollen, the increase in allergy seasons year after year due to climate change in temperatures, longer growing seasons for several plants. We've seen allergy seasons and pollen exposure get worse year after year. And then obviously wildfire smoke is another lung irritant. And that one we've seen certain parts of the countries more than others, and on a global scale, resulting from climate-related drought. So these are some of the basics quickly on air quality and health. But it also, in addition to lung and cardiovascular health, air pollution has been found to impact brain health as well. And this can affect your cognitive functioning, can lead to stroke, dementia, even premature death. And heat as well, air pollution and heat, we just went over both of those, can lead to a lot of these issues with your cognitive functioning. And pardon me for going through all these very quickly, but this is quite a broad topic for y'all today, and I want to make sure I get to some of the disparity information as well. For instance, in addition to redlining changing the way investments are made in cities, communities of color have historically also been targeted for the siting of industrial facilities and highways. This is because they have often and historically been seen as the quote path of least resistance. Planners and city officials over the decades thought these were the communities that would put up less of a fight. At times in the past, that has been true. Luckily, the environmental justice movement, as it continues to gain strength and power and resources, are able to fight back against this more often. But the fact of the matter is, over several decades of development, all of the highway decisions and industrial facility decisions that increase this air pollution in specific areas have been targeted at communities of color. The percent of neighborhoods within a 500-meter radius of highways is shown here through census data and percent of BIPOC communities as well. So you can see that in the keys up here, the darker green areas are higher concentrations of BIPOC residents. And on the right side, the darker red areas are that larger percent near highways. And you can see quite a bit of overlap there. You see this in most cities that you look at, unfortunately. Okay, another climate impact that I'll review fairly quickly for you all is vector-borne diseases and the increase in spread of these diseases due to climate change. Insects and ticks that carry diseases live longer and have a broader geographic range due to changing surface temperatures. You're seeing more of them, you're seeing them spread out further. Increased standing water from changes in precipitation levels can increase their prevalence as well. Standing water and deforestation causing them to move about. They tend to carry things like Lyme disease, West Nile virus, Zika virus, several other airborne diseases that are a real concern for human health. Many of these challenges affect everyone, but several issues, including standing water from increased rainfall, tend to impact communities with less porosity in their land area. So urban areas are included in this as well as areas with older and more out of date stormwater and drainage systems. And again, less green space to help absorb water from excess rainfall. And again, for reasons I've stated before, a lot of the time we see this in communities of color and low income communities in cities. Let's talk about precipitation. I touched on that a little bit just now. You'll find that this one is talked about often. I think we recently did a survey of the American population and what impacts they associate with climate change. And the most understood by the general public is the extreme weather events, is hurricanes and the flooding that comes with that, and the extreme amounts of rainfall, but drought as well. Drought is included in the general bucket of extremes of precipitation. So again, hurricane flooding, wildfires resulting from drought, increased mold from an increase of rainfall, and again, more standing water or property and infrastructure damage, especially when folks can't afford to recover from that quite as quickly, can lead to more mold spores in the air and more of those respiratory impacts as well. All of these things really do fit together. Extreme weather obviously can impact health in the form of injuries from the extreme weather event itself. Increased, again, mold or smoke from wildfire can exacerbate asthma and other respiratory conditions and heart disease. And there's a large impact on mental health from these extreme weather events as well. We talk about climate and mental health and sort of the general climate anxiety lens, but we also, there are several mental health impacts from the trauma of living through an extreme weather event, especially folks that struggle to evacuate. So we see quite a lot of this across the population and these mental health impacts. But again, these large population level mental health impacts coming from a collective event like an extreme weather event, like a hurricane, can add on to other population level mental health stressors like the COVID-19 pandemic, like race-based violence, like, having to fight to keep a roof over your head and food on your table. All of these things in our communities are shared traumas that build and magnify. And it's one of the reasons we really need to think more about community level and population level support for mental health and wellness. Exposures from severe storms and stormwater overflow, as I alluded to earlier, can also lead to sewage, standing water that takes on mold and increases the spread of insects, but also sewage overflow from extreme flooding and extreme weather events is also a common impact that can directly impact the entire community's health from gastrointestinal illnesses. And then, of course, water and flooding can also lead to personal injury. Kansas City is not exempt. Often we talk about flooding in coastal areas. Folks like to focus on that because sea level rise and extreme weather can impact flooding in our coastal areas in the United States. But inland areas are seeing a huge increase in rainfall and precipitation as well. I went before this presentation and just found some very recent articles and news pieces on the situation in Kansas City and the increase in rainfall and flooding that you all have seen as well. And it's unfortunately, again, similar to the story we're seeing all across the country and the world when it comes to increased rainfall from climate change. So I don't know, I can't see the top of this. I'm having a little bit of, let me move this thing. All right, this is kind of a big, and I can share the slides after. This is kind of a large diagram here. I hope folks can see it all clearly. But these are some of the populations that we consider more vulnerable to climate impacts, whether because they are inherently more vulnerable, like older adults that would have trouble potentially evacuating, and children who are, their bodies are just less prepared to fight things like heat stroke and certain illnesses that are exacerbated by climate change. And some communities who are not more vulnerable by nature, but are more vulnerable because of environmental racism, communities of color who have had more exposure over time to air pollutants, who have higher cases of asthma already and are more susceptible to climate impacts harming their health. And then low-income communities also who are, who might struggle to be able to recover from climate disasters quite as quickly, and are therefore less resilient to those disasters, and who might have trouble accessing healthcare, especially in the wake of disaster, but then just generally throughout their lives. So these are just some examples. And when we think about climate adaptation and, trying to reduce the health burdens of the climate crisis, we are to really keep these communities in mind and help improve access to healthcare to help reduce those inequities. And another piece here on environmental racism, which is a huge part of the work that we try to focus on here at the American Public Health Association and our partners at Clean Air Now, who helped provide this slide. Thank you so much. Environmental racism. Race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, or soil. Talked about that earlier with industrial facilities and highways. 56% of the population near toxic waste sites are people of color. 38% have higher nitrogen dioxide exposure, and they are 2 times more likely to live without potable water and modern sanitation. And I mean, it's not on here, but the stormwater systems as well, you've seen after several extreme weather events, particularly Hurricane Harvey in Texas. They examined, actually after Ike, I think 8 years earlier, they had examined stormwater systems, and white neighborhoods were more likely to have the updated underground stormwater systems, and communities of color were more likely to have inadequate open ditch systems. They were warned 8 years later, Harvey hit, and there was so much more flood damage and disparate health impacts in those communities of color. So we know about all of these disparities, all of these infrastructure challenges, the polluters targeting these communities, and we really have to do more to address these disparities and to provide relief. People of color have seen 95% of their claims against polluters denied by the EPA. So this is something that this nation really needs to work on, and we'll hopefully see improving over the next several years. And then here's a quote, a great quote from Dr. Robert Bullard. Environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulation. So some key considerations on the unequal impacts of climate change. Disproportionately impacts the health of low-income communities and communities of color. Climate change and health inequities share the same root causes. And addressing climate change and health inequities requires transformational change in our systems and communities. So I want to talk a little bit about that transformational change and how we can all play a larger part in that. Many of you may have seen this image in the past, really defining the difference between equality and equity. Equality, everyone gets the same help from the government, from whoever, and they're expected to thrive with the exact same. But you'll see in the first half of the picture, not everyone is starting from the same place. Folks need different levels of support to deal with the challenges that they are facing in life. And that is often something we see when it comes to environmental justice and climate justice as well, is you really need to prioritize investments in those communities that see the greatest burden from climate change. It's not just which policies and solutions can reduce emissions overall the most everywhere, but it's also how do we make sure those investments improve the health and the lifestyles of those who have suffered the most. So this you've probably seen before. Then folks like to add a third one. Equality and equity are about what we said before. Justice, equality, everyone benefits from the same supports. Equity, everyone gets the supports they need. Justice, all three can get the desired outcome without supports or accommodations because the causes of the inequities were addressed and the systemic barriers have been removed. And this is more and more what we need to be focusing on. It's not just aid, it's not just relief, but it's removing the systemic barriers and the systemic racism and the things in our policies and in our laws that are standing in folks' way. Now, this is a great image. I have one I like even better from cultural organizing, and it's this one. In the prior image, the barriers, the systemic barriers have magically disappeared and everyone can see the game. In this version, it's showing all of us working together to remove the barriers. And I think that's something we really need to focus on. These things, regardless of what different leaders say at any given moment, removing systemic barriers that are standing in the way of climate justice and health equity really does take everyone, from the person who already could see the game just fine without any help, and the person who had the longest way to go to get to their goals. We all need to see ourselves in the dismantling of those barriers. So this is my favorite version of that image. So when we talk about solutions, first, just on the climate and health side, everyone talks about mitigation versus adaptation. Well, not necessarily versus, because we need both. In fact, there's a saying that folks, always used to say in this space. It's mitigate, adapt, or die, or suffer. Sorry, mitigate, adapt, or suffer. At this point, after this many decades of inaction, after seeing the level of the climate crisis as it is now, and the intense impacts we're seeing all over the world and in our own backyards, it isn't or anymore. It's mitigate, adapt, unfortunately, and suffer, because the suffer is already happening. But the more we mitigate and the more we adapt, the less suffering we'll see in the future, the more we can reduce that side of the equation a little bit. So we really need to focus on both halves of this pie chart, or of this Venn diagram, apologies. Mitigation is reducing emissions, reducing climate emissions, including things like sustainable transportation, clean energy, energy efficiency. Those are just in a couple of sectors. I mean, you'll see we really need to work across sectors. We need to reduce emissions in the healthcare sector. We need to reduce emissions in the agricultural sector. And there are so many great solutions and policy proposals out there to do just that. Adaptation is managing the risks of climate change impacts. It is with the understanding that we are already seeing a lot of those impacts and folks are suffering. It's things like disaster management, flood protection, infrastructure upgrades, things like investing in more trees and green space and smarter like city surfaces that can, increase porosity of cities to deal with stormwater runoff and can increase reflective surfaces to reduce heat. It's to help people bounce back faster from extreme weather events. It's all of those things. And then there are several things that fall in the middle of the Venn diagram that help with both sides of these things. And there's that local food piece, which helps folks access food, especially after disasters on the adaptation side, and makes food more accessible, and also helps to reduce emissions from the agricultural sector. So we really need to pursue all of these solutions. Unfortunately, I know to most people that sounds very daunting. What do I do? What can I advocate for? What can I make a difference on? There are so many policy solutions, and they are really all needed to help us meet our climate goals. We are currently, folks, the IPCC warned against global temperature rises of over 1.5 degrees Celsius. Scientists are now saying that we've got about a 50-50 shot of seeing that in the next 5 years. So at this point, it is all hands on deck. It is all sectors. It is all policies. And luckily, many cities and states and businesses been developing climate action plans, which is an opportunity for folks to really weigh in on a suite of solutions that they are examining, and see who those solutions are benefiting, what might be missing from the picture, and really think about climate strategies comprehensively instead of a piecemeal sector by sector way. And I want to stress here that today, with the urgency and the level that this crisis is at, the solutions we need to be focusing on are at a systems level. There are individual things that each of us can do to help reduce our own carbon footprint and our own emissions. And it is important to keep those things in mind. But I think we've done a fair amount of education around that. In every climate chat you see, or every climate talk you see, you can, see examples of folks sharing tips, buy a more fuel efficient car, recycle, reduce the number of things you order online, try to shop local. All of these things are excellent pieces of advice to live a more sustainable and climate friendly lifestyle. But it today, at the place we're at in this crisis, where we are, globally seeing catastrophic climate impacts and seeing those disparities grow more and more, the solution really needs to be at the systems level. It's political, it's government, it's finance and manufacturing and trade and labor. It's all of these things, it's all sectors, and we really need to see strong movement being taken by policymakers and decision makers. So as far as what we can do, we can recycle, we can buy more fuel efficient cars, we can shop local, but we also need to get motivated to make a difference. We need to advocate for the solutions that we want to see from our policymakers. And every single one of us has a voice that is worthwhile in this particular part of the movement. We all have some lived experience or some level of expertise that decision makers need to hear from, that many of them are very open to hearing from. I mentioned before climate action plans. Reading those, commenting on them, talking to your local elected officials about that, advocating for climate friendly policies and regulations at the local, state, and national level. There are so many organizations out there that are communicating daily opportunities to take action on these types of issues and policies, and using your own experience and your own expertise to do that is an extremely powerful way to make a difference on climate change. One example right now, the federal government has instituted this Justice 40 initiative, where the goal is for 40% of, at least 40% of climate related federal investments, and those going down to states and whatnot, are dedicated to mitigating those climate disparities, those disparate impacts, and that they go to communities of color who need it the most. That is a great opportunity, especially as we see increases in federal investments as well. We just had a huge infrastructure bill pass that is sending so much money to states and localities to invest in infrastructure. And it is now our job with this very well-intended federal policy. It is the job of the people to make sure that those investments are being made in a smart and equitable way. So that's one way to get involved, is to see how your local area, your state is spending that money, and to comment on that, because that is a very active issue right now. And then you can also use your voice for change to spread the word, not just with policymakers, but with your peers. Speak out on social media, ask elected officials and candidates about climate issues, making sure it's on the forefront of those conversations, and telling your personal climate change story to help spread the word about all of these issues. And I want to leave at least 15 minutes for questions, so I'll wrap up quickly here to talk about another way that folks get involved, and that's through local environmental justice organizations like Clean Air Now, who we have some representatives from on the call here today. And they shared a couple of slides here with me as well. So they are dedicated to improving environmental health of those impacted by environmental racism, toxic air pollution, and climate change. I want to give them a second to talk as well. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly, because I've worked with them, but there are people who can speak to their work much more clearly than I can. But I want to, encourage folks to read the plans and the recommendations that they put out there, because this is coming directly from the communities that policymakers are saying they want to represent. And these communities are speaking for themselves. And it's the job of other nonprofits and academics and other folks who want to get involved in the movement to work with them and support and amplify those calls and let them take leadership. So I'm going to leave these up because I think, some considerations for nonprofits and academics working with community-based organizations, and potentially throw it to Beto real quick and see if you have anything you want to add on that front while this slide is up. Or,
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine, for your presentation. Very thorough presentation on climate inequities, not just here in Kansas City, but across the country, right? And so, I just wanted to thank you for that presentation. I just wanted to add a little bit about maybe this slide right here, right? How is it that we all work together to advance climate equity, climate justice, environmental justice, and working alongside other nonprofits that are not also funded, right, but the same industries that are polluting our communities, right? There are nonprofits that take money from polluters, from the utilities or polluters, and that's one thing that we need to also think about. It's if we want to advance real climate action, that we need to be really careful that the same organizations do not depend on this funding. And when it comes to academia, I really like this slide because it's really creating that trust building relationship with community, right? Making sure that they can listen to the community and take, like you mentioned, Catherine, those lived experiences into consideration when putting a project together, a health research project, an intervention, right? That you do it alongside community members. And there are great organizations like Clean Air Now. I may be biased, but Clean Air Now is a great organization in Kansas City that really looks at everything from an equitable lens, right? From academia to government, foundations, funding, where it comes from, all these things play a big role in our organization and how we look at things and how we move forward together. And so I love this slide because it really shares, be an ally, let the front lines lead, and stand behind us and support us, because the communities are the ones that are being impacted day in, day out, breathing, struggling to breathe. And so really being that added support, right? And I think that together there's ways to move forward and do some really cool collaborative health interventions and projects that really bring some direct benefits, relief to the communities that have left behind. And so with that, I'll stop there, and I want to open it up for questions. But before we get into that question of others, I have a question based on one of your slides. Catherine, you mentioned recycling, composting, transit, all that. These are all good things, right, for our environment in a whole. Like anyone can do this on their own. But what we have noticed is really our government's putting the emphasis on those issues, right, of riding the bus, riding a bicycle, planting trees, composting. However, we know, like you said, that the systems change needs to come from our government, political power, right? Because a lot of these community members that are trying to put food on the table every day, day in, day out, don't have access to public transportation, do not have access to green spaces. Sometimes they don't have access to a community garden. So really putting that the carbon footprint on communities is also a fossil fuel agenda, right? A fossil fuel talking point. So I really appreciated you mentioning that, how we really need to take a holistic approach from our government, political will, and those that support and really want to advance climate justice across here locally and across the country. So with that, I'll stop there. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. If you want to add a little bit more to that, go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, I'll take one example from that. Thank you, Beto. I think that's really helpful. A lot of, climate advocates, like the example you gave of taking transit instead of driving to reduce your carbon footprint. In my last position at the Union of Concerned Scientists, I co-authored a report looking at Washington, D.C.'s transit system accessibility, and overlined that with communities of color in the region, sort of looking at the larger DC metro region. And not only are those communities less likely to have covered bus shelters and comfortable and dry places to wait, so as far as the physical infrastructure of bus stops, but also the routes and lines that come through their communities are fewer and less consistent. We used a model that showed just the travel time from any particular community to the areas of the cities where most of the jobs are located. And generally, communities of color had a longer travel time on transit than white communities in the region. So, exactly, a lot of those systems, again, those investments skipped over communities of color, and to put that burden on individuals when the systems we operate in are not optimized to make those climate friendly choices easy and accessible choices is really missing the point. So again, I'm always an and person, encourage those behaviors, but make it clear that those are not the solution, and be aware of the fact that not everyone can take advantage of all of those, climate friendly systems and solutions. So yeah, absolutely, Beto, thank you.
Thank you.
I see a question in the chat about who we offer this presentation to. I'll go really talk to anybody as long as I have time. We have at APHA, we have state affiliates all over the country. I'm presenting later this week actually to our Tennessee Public Health Association on a lot of this similar information. Depending on the time allotted, we get into more of the nitty gritty on the health impacts sometimes, but I think this high level overview is really helpful generally. And I am always happy to share slides with folks that are all interested in giving this presentation themselves and communicating about climate and health to various audiences, because I think it's really important to continue getting the word out there. Yeah, any other questions, folks can raise their hand or jump in. But I do want to touch on, and I didn't really have a slide on this, but I know I'm speaking to a lot of subject matter experts in the room today that have a lot to offer. This movement overall and the advocacy space in this movement. There is academics and experts and myself included, who want to work on these issues with community organizations and help uplift environmental justice movements and fight for equitable health outcomes. We definitely have understood how much of a need there is for not only communicating how best to do that, but better facilitating that relationship building. So actually, I've been working with Beto, who you just heard from, with Dr. Elizabeth Friedman, who is maybe I think on this call as well. And there's so many names I can't tell, but is also an expert, a subject matter expert on environmental health, who has been working with Cleaner Now and other environmental justice organizations for years and is an expert on this. The three of us, along with partners at the Union of Concerned Scientists, have been working to create an online platform to help facilitate some of those connections and create relationships among subject matter experts and environmental justice communities. Luckily, there's an environmental justice representative or two in here today, so some of those connections can be made more easily sometimes. But SciCan, the Science and Community Action Network, and I'll drop the link in the chat here, scican.org, is something we're launching very soon to help make those connections between communities, environmental justice communities across the country, and between environmental justice communities and subject matter experts who want to help. Sorry, Beto, do you have a link for the sign up for the webinar handy? Folks can look at that if they're interested as well. We have a webinar coming up at the end of the month, a training and a workshop to help scientists and other experts learn how to better engage with environmental justice communities and community organizations. So I wish I had that link handy, and I really should, and I probably could get it in a second while someone's asking a question. Shelly, I see your hand up.
Yes. First of all, hi, Catherine. How are you? It's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yes. Thanks so much for coming in today. This is really a treat to have you come in for our community conversation series. This is fantastic. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. And I like how you zoomed it in. So you saved on the carbon emissions from flying over, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
We relied too much on in-person events and travel before. I know Zoom can be exhausting, but it can be engaging as well.
Yes,
it's important
absolutely.
to look into how to engage on Zoom.
Yeah. Well, great presentation. It was really eye-opening to see the specific, not just the health effects, but also the disparities that exist. The question I have is about the movement for net zero, carbon neutral, net zero, because I hear controversy behind that movement, where that may not be the path forward. So is it because of the disparities that currently exist that could widen as we approach net zero, carbon neutral society? Is that the source of the disagreement with going with that approach?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, Shelley. Thank you. Yes, net zero, the idea of net zero, as opposed to just zero emissions, getting rid of our reliance on carbon. Net zero can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. And a lot of the time when you're focusing on overall emissions reductions and not focusing on where it's coming from or how it's offset, or, a lot of these like carbon economy issues, is you'll end up reducing them in certain areas and exacerbating health impacts in others. So you see it as an easy way sometimes for companies or industrial areas to clean up one facility and sort of route a little bit more pollution to another one, but overall they're reducing, right? Overall, or buying carbon offsets somewhere else, but continuing their current behaviors in other areas. So it's hard. There have been some examples. I mean, for instance, when we focus on the balance overall, vehicle electrification is one thing that is a complicated, very complex issues, because as you're reducing overall these broad, emissions from engines, tailpipe emissions, and relying more on electricity to power cars, how is that electricity being generated? Where is it being generated? Even though in every case, on every grid in the country, vehicles powered by electricity do create less carbon pollution than vehicles powered by gas. It doesn't matter how the grid is powered. In every case, you will reduce emissions by electrifying. So that sounds like a good thing, like net good, less carbon emissions, better for climate change. But you're going from these very spread out emissions to more burden on particular power plants and in particular neighborhoods. So it's just something to think about. Net zero can get rid of that complexity sometimes and can continue to make things worse for communities where, again, polluters see the path of least resistance, where they feel like we can keep polluting here or pollute more here while overall reducing our emissions. So it's a complicated dance, especially when you get into being able to buy offsets and completely other countries, which again, overall for the larger climate picture is a good thing, but you have to look carefully at who's being impacted by all of these choices. So that is the general issue around those net zero policies.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine, for that explanation on net zero. I just want to add that maybe at a different community conversation, we can have a more in-depth conversation about that. And the forest offsets, which a lot of industry has really been really sold out communities and indigenous communities in other parts of the world by this net zero and offsetting pollution, right, to communities where they still benefit. It's a loophole where they continue to benefit and finance pollution and taking out, and then there's land grabs and all that. But and it's a fossil fuel agenda, right? Making sure that net zero, really what we're saying is that we're not willing to eliminate our consumption on fossil fuels or our industrial pollution, right? Really, we're saying that we're not ready to do that. And that's where all this ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge has played a big role in how we look at all this. So we can say this for a different presentation, but I just wanted to touch just a little bit on that. So thank you so much, Catherine, for that great response to the net zero problems that our communities of color are facing and will continue to face, because we know that it's not going to be an equitable distribution again of pollution. And so I'll stop. Thank you. Okay, and then we have like 3 more minutes. I don't know if anyone has another question. Another question, someone in the audience. I see something here. Net zero also does not take carbon out. Thank you, Gail. Thank you for that comment, Gail. Gail is a unified government air quality person at the UG. So really good to see that. Good to see that comment there. How we can bring in some different speakers to talk more in depth about that. So, well, with that, I think we have about 3 more minutes. If there isn't any more questions, I would just love for everyone to again just thank Catherine for this presentation. I think it was very well received and very well done. And so, anything else you want to add, Shelly? I don't want to leave you out as we're like co-coordinators of this program.
No, you were great, Beto. This was awesome. Thanks again, Catherine, and thank you for, I think we are at 30 folks that were on this call, which is fantastic. So we're definitely growing every month. As Beto mentioned earlier, we're doing this once a month. So please join us for the next event, which will be hosted by KU Lawrence. As you know, we alternate between the Met Center and Lawrence. So the next one will be at KU Lawrence, also virtually by Zoom. So it'll be the same link that we have. It'll be next month. And we hope to have you all there. And please tell your friends about us, and we can keep our audience growing.
Thank
And
you, Shelley.
also, one last thing is our sustainability challenge is open. So you can go to our website and there is an application on there. So any sustainable idea for your community, it doesn't have to be on a campus, but it can be on campus, but also for the communities that you want to pilot, we will fund $1,500 towards your idea for the winner. So please, we made it simple and quick and easy to fill out an application. And it's about, the theme is around around climate change and health. Please
Thank you.
email me if you have any.
Oh, you went on mute at the end there, Shelley.
Oh, I think it was just email. You can email us or email Shelley if you have any questions on that. And so with that, I want to just appreciate everyone who attended. We see a lot of experts here and also community members. We also see our academic partner, Dr. Elizabeth Friedman, who is our environmental health academic partner, really someone is very critical to the work that we do on advancing environmental justice, but looking at it from the public health perspective, right? So appreciate you being here in attendance, and all of you, Anna, who is our organizer, and Gail, everyone here. So I like to be very appreciative of everyone. So just for all of you, thank you for being here today, and thank you. We'll see you at our
Thank
next
you.